Climate change. Here the numbers get really squishy, but somewhere between 20 and 30% of the greenhouse gases produced by our species can be traced to the food system. And I'll talk a little more later about how that happens. But it is the carbon in the soil released through tilling. It is the methane released by animals, which is a much more serious greenhouse gas than carbon. I mean, in the sense that it can trap a lot more heat. And nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas you don't hear very much about, but it also can trap a lot more heat than carbon. And it is released by fertilizer. When fertilizer mixes with water in fields and is not taken up by plants. Now, the good news in all this is that whatever progress we make in reforming our food system, we will be making considerable progress in addressing the energy crisis, the climate crisis, and the healthcare crisis. Okay? There's a lot of low-hanging fruit for attacking those problems. And food, of course, also powerfully influences politics. You only have to go back to 2008, where we had an enormous spike in grain prices due to some bad harvests and some speculation on Wall Street, with the result that 34 countries saw food riots. The Arab Spring got started at that point. The price of food is one of the most powerful political facts on the ground anywhere you go. So you cannot hope to understand the environment, health, economics, or politics without understanding how we feed ourselves and organize our food system. So, again, food is fundamental. And in the last 75 years, it has changed more dramatically than in the previous 10,000. And that goes back to the beginning of agriculture. Now, that's the story I want to tell. I want to tell the modern part of that story to give you some context for what is going to follow this semester. So this is going to be a short and somewhat superficial review of how we got where we are. And let me tell you about my own personal recognition that something had changed. Okay, this happens to me before I wrote Omnivore's Dilemma. In fact, it kind of gave me the idea for Omnivore's Dilemma. I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up on Long Island and then New York City. And my sense of what agriculture was very much shaped by eastern, tiny, picket fencey farms. You never saw a farm more than 100 acres. I'm thinking about New England, on Long Island. And I thought that's what agriculture was. And while I was still living there, I got an assignment to write an article about genetically modified food when it was just being introduced. This is 1996 or 97. And so I went down to Monsanto and I spent time with their scientists, and I actually grew a genetically modified potato in my garden to see what it was all about and whether it worked. But that's not what I want to focus on right now. I want to focus on the farms that I was introduced to. And Monsanto wanted me to see one of their success stories, a very successful potato farmer in the Magic Valley of Idaho. And so I flew out there and went to see a potato farm in Idaho, classic place where the French fries get made. And I was just it blew my mind. This farm was about 35,000 acres. I didn't imagine there were farms that big. It was divided into these crop circles that you see when you fly over the country. You see those green coins in the desert. And what that is a circular field, 175 acres each. They're huge. And it has this giant irrigation pivot that goes around and continually, and it's putting out water, because you're in the desert, fertilizer, and pesticide. And it was all being controlled in the guy's garage. He had a little kind of bunker set up in his garage in a concrete room, and you went in there, and there was a screen, and on each screen was like 9 of these or 12 of these little circles, and each one he could tell what was going on. Did it need water? What was the soil temperature? All this kind of stuff. And he could direct what happened, and he would turn on and off his sprays of pesticides from there. And I asked him why he farmed this way, and he explained that he uses some pesticides. And again, this has nothing to do with genetically modified food. He uses some pesticides that are very, very toxic. So toxic, in fact, that you can't go out into your field for 3 days after you spray them. There was one in particular called Monitor. And this was such a potent neurotoxin that even if an irrigation pivot broke and he was going to lose 175 acres, he would not go out to fix it, or he would not send one of his workers out to fix it. It was that dangerous a chemical. And I said, well, why do you use it? What does it help you with? And he said, oh, it's how we deal with something called net necrosis. And I said, what is net necrosis? And I said, well, if you've ever sliced into a potato or bitten into a French fry and you've seen those kind of brown lines, a little brown vein or brown dots, that's net necrosis. And I said, what is it? I said, well, it's carried by an aphid from plant to plant, and the way you get rid of it in russet potatoes is you spray this chemical. And I said, is there any alternative? And he said, well, yeah, it's really only a problem in russet Burbank potatoes. And I said, can you grow another kind? And he said, no, that's the only kind McDonald's will take. So you see how the connections between our ideal of a perfect French fry, and the reason McDonald's likes russet Burbanks is they're the longest potato, and they love that effect of the potatoes making that little bouquet in the red envelope, and you can't get that with another kind of potato. Now, once these potatoes, a lot of the pesticides on these potatoes are what's called systemics. They're not just on the surface. They actually are taken up by the potato when it's growing, and they're in every cell so that insects that eat it get killed. So the problem with that is, though, that you can't eat these potatoes during the growing season because they're so full of this pesticide. So what they do is, he showed me where after they harvest the potatoes, they go into these gigantic atmosphere-controlled sheds that they're the size of a stadium. And we went into one of these, and the temperature was carefully adjusted. It was cold, and the potatoes were piled in a giant pyramid. I've never seen so many potatoes in my life. And I said, why? And he said, well, we can't sell them right away because of all the pesticides. So they have to off-gas their chemicals, and that takes about 6 weeks. And then you can eat them. It's sort of like a new carpet or a new office building. You just don't want to be near it for a while. So I was like, wow, okay, so this is how the French fries get made. How interesting. And then very soon after that, I was reporting another story, and I was driving down Route 5, and many of you have made this drive from San Francisco to LA or back, and you know that there's something very striking on the way. And I had never done this drive, and I was heading south. And suddenly, it was a beautiful fall day, the Golden Hills, were spread out, and the sky was blue, and to a New Yorker, this was such a treat. And then suddenly, in this idyllic scene, this smell assaulted my nostrils. And it was like the last time I had smelled anything like it, it was in the men's room at the old Port Authority in New York, which you're not old enough to remember, but it was really nasty. But when I looked around, nothing had changed. It was just golden California hills as far as I could see. And it took 3 miles before I came to, what? Harris Ranch. Yeah. Known to its neighbors as Cowschwitz. No, it is. I don't call it that. And this is a gigantic feedlot. I think it's got, I don't know how many head it has. It looked like 50,000 head, and they're right on the road. I mean, it's actually the best feedlot in the country in that it's most open to journalists, and people can actually see what's going on. Most feedlots are hidden in the high plains off the main roads. And there's this giant feed bunk along the highway, and the animals are eating, and in the distance you will see another 2 great pyramids. One is corn, which the animals are eating, and the other is cow shit, which the animals are producing. And essentially they're translating that pile of corn into that pile of crap and making some meat along the way. And there it was, the Happy Meal, hamburger and French fries. And I had no idea how they were produced. So for me, that was kind of the wake-up call, those 2 scenes, and I've never forgotten them. And they really got me launched on trying to figure out, why do we do it this way? What are the advantages? So this is the story of how we got there. American agriculture before World War II looked a lot like the images on the packages today of American agriculture, which are completely deceptive, which is to say, you know, a house, a picket fence, a red barn, some chickens, some corn, you know, a bunch of different crops. You know, it's like the Cargill ads. There's an image of American agriculture, and it's diversified, it's small, it's family farming.